Assalamu alaikum, guys. It's Friday. It's our last lesson of the week. So we are on chapter 7.6. It's a little bit of a spin-off of yesterday. So you kind of learned already most of the major steps to this. Notice that today we're still factoring. Now we have 2x squared minus 13x plus 6. So the difference is now that there is a leading coefficient. In other words, in the expression, there's a number right in front of the first term. So the first thing you need to do, and this is the twist, your leading coefficient and your constants, okay? You first need to find the product of that, and you do have to keep track of negatives and such. So first of all, 2 times 6 is equal to 12, okay? So now your two conditions, we're gonna go back to the product. So the product of two numbers has to equal that 12 that you just found, and then at the same time, the sum of those two numbers has to give you the value of the middle term, which is negative 13. So now start thinking, I'm no longer going to be supporting that what are the factors of 12? 1 times 12, 2 times 6, 3 times 4, although you can do it, but in the lecture I'm not going to do it. So when I think of the factors of 12 that can give me the sum of 13 as well, I know that it's 1 and 12, okay? So 1 and 12 are my numbers. Now, I need to make sure that it equals to negative 13. So then the only way I can come up with that with a sum is if both of them are negative. And then just again, check your product. Negative 1 times negative 12 is a positive 12. So we're going to do the same thing as yesterday. Drop your first term, okay? And it's 2x squared. And then the middle terms create this, the negative 13. So I have negative 1x, then minus 12x, and then don't forget drop the 6. So we're going back to, again, divided in half. So for the first half, what is the GCF? Obviously, I'm not going to write 1 as one of my factors for 2x and 1, because every single number has 1, but I know that both of them are divisible by x. On the second part, remember, this is negative. So I know that my GCF has to be negative. And then what is the common factor between 12x and 6? Both of the numbers are divisible by negative 6. So factored out was my x, and then I go back to the division. 2x squared divided by x leaves me with 2x. And then negative 1x divided by x, remember x's cancel out, it leaves me with negative 1. My GCF on the second part was negative 6, so minus 6 drops down. And then 12x divided by 6 leaves me with 2x. And then at the end I have positive 6 divided by negative 6. Positive divided by negative is negative. And then 6 divided by 6 is 1. And again, you're going to go back to the checking. Are my parentheses the same? Yes, they are. So then remember, one of your factors are your GCFs, and the other one is whatever's in parentheses. So x minus 6 is one of my factors, and the other one is 2x minus 1. So it's pretty much exactly the same as last time, except for that twist. Take the leading coefficient, multiply it to the constant, and that's going to become your product, okay? So let's take another example. Let's say that we have 4x squared minus 9x and then plus 5. Again, my leading coefficient and my constant are 4 times 5, which equals 20. So then my two conditions, something times itself will give you, something to another times another number will give you 20. At the same time, my middle term is negative 9. So the sum of those two numbers is going to equal to negative 9. Now, I know that the only way I can come up with 9 is 4 times 5. And 4 times 5 gives me 20. So I'm going to choose 4 times 5. All right. So it is a negative 9. So then that means that both of them are negative, and then just test negative 4 times negative 5 gives you that 20. So go ahead and drop your 4x squared down, and it's minus 4 minus 5. So minus 4x minus 5x, and then drop your 5. Remember, these two must equal the middle term, the two terms on the middle. So again, do your halves, and both of these values, the 4x squared minus 4x, are both divisible by 4. Then go to the variables. What's the maximum number of variables that you can pull out? Both are divisible by x as well. On the next half, remember, starts with a negative. So therefore, what's the common factor between 5x and 5? It's going to be negative 5. Okay. So my factor was, my GCF was 4x, and then when it's 4x squared divided by 4x, remember the 4's cancel each other out. You're left with x squared divided by x. That's x. And then obviously negative divided by positive is negative. And what's 4x divided by 4x? It equals 1. Then on this next half, the GCF was negative 5, so I drop a minus 5 down. And then again, what is 5x divided by 5? It leaves you x, and then positive divided by negative is negative. 5 divided by 5 is 1. And are my parentheses the same? Yes, they are. So one of my factors are my GCFs, 4x minus 5. Okay. And then my other factor is whatever is in parentheses. So you're noticing that it's basically like yesterday's lesson. So let's go ahead and do a couple of more examples. So far I've been having where it's negative and positive. Now let's do it the other way around where it's positive and then negative as well. Now if it's positive and positive, you know that your conditions, the both numbers will be positive. But I'm teaching you the negative ones because those are the ones that are a little bit more challenging. So let's go to our next example, 4n squared plus 11n minus 3. Again, leading coefficient and the constant, and you do have to keep track of negatives. So 4 times negative 3 is negative 12. And then your two conditions is what times what will give you negative 12 at the same time. When you add them up, it gives you a positive 11. So I know that the only factors of 12 that can be close to 11, whether it's a sum or difference, is 1 and 12. So my factors are 1 and 12. And then think about it. The product is negative, so that means one of the numbers has to be negative. And the only way I can get 11 is if the 1 is negative. So negative 1 plus 12 gives me that 11. So go ahead and drop your 4n squared, and then it's minus 1n plus 12. So minus 1n plus 12n minus 3 drops down. And then split it in half. Now what's the GCF on the first half? The only thing that I can divide both sides by is n. And then on the second half, it's a positive, so I know my GCF has to be positive. It starts with a positive, the 12n. What is the common factor between 12 and 3? It's going to be 3. Now, our factored out first half, the GCF was n, and then what's 4n squared divided by n? It's going to be 4n, and then negative 1n divided by n. Remember the n's cancel out, and you're left with negative 1. On the second half, remember it's a positive 3, so let's write plus 3. And then what's 12n divided by 3? It's 4n. And then negative 3 divided by a positive 3 is negative 1. And again, our parentheses are the same. We're ready to finish the answer. So n plus 3, and then the other factor is 4n minus 1. Now this last example, and then I'm going to have to teach you the one about what happens when the whole expression starts with a negative. So we have 3m squared plus m minus 14 plus m minus 14. So leading coefficient and the constant. So when you go ahead and take, 3 times negative 14, use your calculator, it equals to negative 42. So my two conditions, when I find the product of two numbers, it has to equal to negative 42. At the same time, the sum has to equal the invisible one that you don't see there. So what are the factors of 42 that can give me a sum or difference of 1, 6, and 7? So 6 and 7 are my values. And then, of course, the sum of 1 can only be brought about if the 6 is negative. So negative 6 times 7 is negative 42, and those are the factors I'm using. So I drop my 3m squared minus 6 plus 7 minus 6m plus 7m and drop the negative 14. Divide in half. What's the GCF in the first half? Both are divisible, both of the terms are divisible by 3, and both of them are divisible by m. So my GCF is 3m on that. Now on the second half, remember it's a positive 7m or a plus 7m. Both of the terms are divisible by 7. So go ahead and get your final answer. It's 3m, which was the factor, the GCF. Then what's 3m squared divided by 3m? It leaves you with only an m. And then negative 6m divided by 3m. Remember, the m's cancel out because it equals 1. And then negative 6 divided by 3 is negative 2. On the second half, the GCF was a positive 7, so plus 7. And then what's 7m divided by 7? The 7's cancel each other out because they equal 1. And then you drop the m down. Then negative 14 divided by a positive 7, it's going to be negative 2. My two parentheses equal each other. I'm ready to give the last, my final answer. 3m plus 7, and then m minus 2. So for our last example, guys, when you're factoring expressions, especially if they're written in standard form, and this goes back to chapter 7.2, lesson 7.2, when you're trying to find a GCF, if the leading term starts with a negative, your GCF has to be factored out as a negative as well. So let's start with this one. And we've got a negative 5m squared, and then plus 6m minus 1. So we're still doing the same thing, except we're going to have to wait for one step. So if it starts with a negative, first thing I need to do is factor out the negative. And the way I factor out the negative is by dividing everything by a negative 1. Okay? So if I divide everything by a negative 1, my negative 1 that I factored now changes the original expression. Negative 5m squared divided by a negative 1 becomes a positive 5m. Positive 6m divided by a negative 1 becomes a negative 6m. And then a negative 1 divided by a negative 1 becomes a positive 1. Now you're going to be keeping track of that negative 1 as we go along, okay? So here we go. Go back to the factoring of the previous steps that we were doing. 5 times 1 equals 5. And then my two conditions, remember, something times something will give me that 5. At the same time, when I add them up, it's going to give me a negative 6. And what are the factors of 5? Well, the only factors you have are 1 and 5. So we know that the two numbers that we're dealing with are 1 and 5. And since this 6 is negative, we know that both of the values are going to be negative. So the negative 1, guys, I'm just going to drop it down as a negative, okay? Your final answer should not have that 1. But I'm dropping the 1 now already. So let's break this down. Bring your 5m squared down, and then it's minus 1 plus 5. So minus 1m plus 5m, and then plus 1 drops down. Okay, so now go ahead and split it in half. And sorry, it's not plus 5, it's minus 5. Okay, because both of them are -1 and then -5. So here we go. Both of these terms, the 5m squared minus the 1m, are both divisible by m. Okay? And then, since this starts with a negative, the -5m or the -5m, I know my GCF is going to be negative. And then what's the common factor between 5m and 1? It's only 1. Okay? So here we go, ready to get close to the final answer. Drop your negative down. You have to keep track of it. Now, my GCF on the first half was m. And then what's 5m squared divided by m? It leaves you with 5m. And then -1m divided by m. The m's cancel out. And you drop your -1 down. And then the GCF on the second half was -1. So let's put -1. And then 5m divided by that 1 is going to give you 5m. And remember, technically what you're doing, -5m divided by -1 is a positive 5m. And then at the end, you have a positive 1 divided by a -1 gives you -1. Both of the parentheses are the same. So my final answer, I have to have the negative that I factored out from the very beginning. M minus 1 is one of my factors, and the other factor is 5m minus 1. So my final answer is negative, and then parentheses open, m minus 1, and then parentheses closed, and then next parentheses open, 5m minus 1, parentheses closed. So, inshallah, you found it easy, and I think if you practice yesterday's lesson, it'll make this lesson easy as well. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to come to class. See you in class.